everyone. Today's video lesson is lesson 1.04. It is called Continuing Tension, and we are going to continue to talk about the Cold War. And today we are going to be looking at a new leader in the Soviet Union. Remember when we talked about the Korean War, as part of the lesson on the Korean War, we talked about the fact that Stalin had died of a stroke, or maybe it was poisoning, during the Korean War. So today we are going to find out who the new leader of the Soviet Union is. We are also going to talk a little bit about what life was like in some of those Eastern Bloc countries, or those countries that would be considered behind the Iron Curtain. And we are also going to look a little bit at the Berlin Wall. So those are some of our topics for today. So by the end of today's lesson, you should be able to describe how Nikita Khrushchev came to power. And yes, Nikita Khrushchev is the leader of the Soviet Union following Stalin's death. And you're also going to be able to explain why the West did not act to keep the Soviet Union from interfering in the Hungarian Revolution. So we're going to find out what happened in the Hungarian Revolution, and we are going to find out how the Soviet Union reacted to the Hungarian Revolution, and how the United States and the West reacted to the Hungarian Revolution, and maybe how that was a little different from how the West reacted and acted in Korea. And then again, we're going to talk a little bit about the Berlin Wall. So those are our main topics of today. So like I just mentioned, remember in 1953, while the Korean War was going on, Stalin did die. Officially, he died of a stroke. He died about 4 days after he suffered a stroke. However, there are many historians who think that perhaps he was poisoned, and it was not really a stroke. But either way, Stalin is no longer in the picture, and Nikita Khrushchev is going to take over as leader of the Soviet Union. So Nikita Khrushchev was elected as Soviet Communist Party General Secretary. He was a likable man with a sense of humor. He had been a Stalin henchman in the 1920s, so he was very close to Stalin in the 1920s. But he also had plenty of ruthlessness and cunning in him as well. On his way to power, on his way to being the leader of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev had his one main rival to power arrested, convicted of being a Western spy, and shot. So after Stalin died, there were two main people who could have become leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was one, and then his main rival was the other. And as you can see, Khrushchev made certain that his main rival would not get the job as leader of the Soviet Union. And by 1956, about 3 years after Stalin died, Khrushchev was the dominant leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was committed to communist ideas. However, he believed that the only way to move forward was to admit past errors of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. So at a meeting of the Soviet Communist Party, he revealed how many people Stalin had killed. And it is a very, very large number, the number of people who were killed under Stalin, both civilians as well as people, maybe political rivals, people in power who were killed by Stalin, what were known as his purges. The delegates were shocked at this number and did not want to admit this to the world. They did not want to admit how many people Stalin had killed. Also, after Khrushchev was elected to the head of the Soviet Communist Party, those Soviet satellites thought that they might now have more freedom to run their states without as much interference from Moscow. Remember, those Soviet satellites, remember these could also be called puppet governments, but they were those countries behind the Iron Curtain who were very much influenced by the Soviet Union. And really the Soviet Union controlled them while the countries were still independent countries. So that's why they're also called puppet governments. And when Stalin was in power, everything Stalin said they had to do. And they were hopeful that with Khrushchev in power, that they might have more freedom to run their own countries without so much interference from Moscow, which is the capital of the Soviet Union. So here we can see those Soviet satellite nations. The Soviet Union itself is all of this area over here, this dark green country, and then everywhere to the right of it would be considered the Soviet Union. And then there were countries under communist control. So these would be those Soviet satellites, those puppet governments, places like East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. So these are all places that we consider behind the Iron Curtain. They are communist countries. They are under the control of the Soviet Union, but they are still independent countries. So the red line that you see here is what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. Remember, the Iron Curtain was not a physical barrier. It was just a metaphor. There was no actual wall or curtain built there. It's just a metaphor. And then everything behind the Iron Curtain over here to the right of it was under communist control. And then everything on this map to the left of the Iron Curtain would be Western Germany, those Western countries that are allied with the United States. Some of them, but not all of them, are part of NATO. So keep this in mind as we go forward. Keep in mind what countries are considered behind the Iron Curtain, which ones are under communist control, because in just a few minutes we're going to talk about what life was like in these countries, and you'll be able to see some of the distinct differences between life in the West and life in the East behind the Iron Curtain. However, it would take more than speeches by Khrushchev to get freedoms. When the Polish Communist Party installed a new leader without getting Khrushchev's approval, Khrushchev threatened to send in Soviet troops. And remember, Poland is one of those countries that is behind the Iron Curtain, so controlled by the Soviet Union. So again, they thought they'd be able to do some things that they wanted to without so much interference from Moscow, but they were wrong. The Hungarian Revolution is another place that we're going to see that even though they thought they would be able to have more freedoms, this was actually not the case. In the spring of 1956, Hungarians poured into the streets to demand more freedoms. Again, on this map, we can see that Hungary is here, again, behind the Iron Curtain. So they want more freedoms. So they are trying to revolt to get some more freedoms in their communist country. Khrushchev sent Soviet tanks to put down the rebellion, and as a result of this, about 20,000 Hungarians died for defying the Soviets. The Western leaders, they protested but did nothing to help the people of Hungary. So why would the West help in Korea but not in Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution? So this is a question that I really want you to think about. Why would the West help in one place like Korea, but they would not help in Hungary? In both cases, the Soviet Union was involved. So why is the United States only helping in one place, but not in the other? Well, think about that idea of containment, because the answer to this question goes directly back to that idea of containment. Remember that the official policy of the United States during the Cold War was containment. They wanted to stop communism from spreading. They would go to war to stop communism from spreading, but would not go to the war to get communism out of places where it already existed. Hungary had been a communist country all along, so Khrushchev's show of force did not represent a spread of communism. So that is why the United States did not get involved. Remember, in Korea, when North Korea invaded South Korea was non-communist. So if North Korea would have won that war, communism would have spread, which the U.S. wanted to stop the spread of communism using that policy of containment. Hungary, however, if we go back to the map, we can see that Hungary is one of those light green countries. It is already a communist country. So the USSR, the Soviet Union, invading Hungary would not have communism spreading because communism was already there. So that is why the United States, will see throughout some of these units, the United States going to help some countries around the world, but not helping others. And you always have to think back to that idea of containment. Was communism threatening to spread, or was communism already there? And that will help to explain why the United States and the West helped in some situations, but didn't in others. So I also said we were going to talk about the Berlin Wall. Remember that at the end of World War II, Germany was divided between the victors of the war. And remember, at the end of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States and those Western countries, they were allies with each other. They had that common goal of defeating Hitler. But once World War II was over, they became the United States and the Soviet Union became the two world superpowers. Differences of opinion about communism and capitalism, and remember, this is why we have the Cold War. But Germany was split up before World War II was over. So West Germany, remember, it was split into East and West. West Germany was controlled by the Western countries, by the United States, Great Britain, and France. East Germany was controlled by the Soviet Union. So remember, not only was Germany divided between East and West, but Berlin was also divided between East and West. The capital city was divided between East and West. West Berlin was controlled by the West, again by the United States, Great Britain, and France, and East Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union. Now remember, we learned about this with the Berlin airlift. Berlin itself is completely inside of East Germany. So the area on the screen, this is the French, British, and American sectors. Remember, those are pockets of democracy inside of communist East Germany. So some differences between East Berlin and West Berlin. Remember, this is the same city that's just divided. West Berlin was controlled by the United States, France, and Great Britain. Most of the wreckage of the war had disappeared, of World War II had disappeared. There were office buildings, there were shops, there were cafes and theaters. People had consumer goods. There were refrigerators, washing machines, and cars were very common in West Berlin. And this was a pocket of freedom inside of otherwise communist East Germany. East Berlin, however, remember, this is just another side of a city, not a completely different country. Another side of the city was controlled by the Soviet Union. It was a drab city with evidence of the war still visible. There were empty storefronts. Buildings were still scarred by the war from bombings that had happened there. There were very few, if any, consumer goods available, so the people didn't have refrigerators, washing machines, or cars inside of East Berlin. However, the one thing that they did have the freedom to do was to go to West Berlin. Remember, it's a city that's divided, so you might have family or friends who live in West Berlin, and you might live in East Berlin, but you can go visit your family and friends there. You can go to the shops and the cafes and the theaters in West Berlin if you want to. But that will all change on August 13th, 1961. That is when the Berlin Wall was built. East Berlin, with the help of the Soviet Union, built the Berlin Wall in order to keep the people in East Berlin. Many of the people were fleeing East Berlin for the freedoms of West Berlin, and the wall was put up to stop this. So the wall was put up to keep people of East Berlin in East Berlin, to stop them from going over to the freedoms, to the theaters, to the cafes, to the shops of West Berlin. This also meant they could no longer visit family and friends who lived on the other side of the wall. So if you lived in East Berlin and your aunts and uncles lived in West Berlin, after August 13th, 1961, you could no longer go visit them while the Berlin Wall was up. So the Berlin Wall, again, was built to keep people in East Berlin. It wasn't to keep people out of East Berlin. It was to keep people in East Berlin. So the United States is going to react to the building of the Berlin Wall. And how do you think that the United States reacted to the Soviet Union and East Berlin building the Berlin Wall in order to keep people of East Berlin inside of East Berlin? Think about that question. It's what we are going to start off our next Class Connect session with. So think about this question. How do you think the United States reacted? If you were president of the United States, it was President Kennedy at the time, but if you were president of the United States, how would you react to the Soviet Union and East Berlin building the Berlin Wall? Again, think about it. What would you do? And we'll talk about this in Class Connect and see what the United States did. If you have questions, please let me know. I will see you in our next Class Connect session.